She knocked on my door at 8:30 on a Thursday night, holding a casserole dish covered in foil and wearing the same flak jacket she'd had on at the site meeting that afternoon. I said, "Trent's not home this weekend." She said, "I know." Then she walked past me into the kitchen like she'd been there 100 times, even though she hadn't, set the dish on the counter, and started looking through my cupboards for serving spoons. I stood in the doorway for a moment longer than I should have. Looking back now, she had already decided before she ever knocked. I was just slow to catch up. "My name is Fletcher Haynes. I'm 38 years old and I work as a project manager for a mid-sized construction firm out of Hamilton, Ontario. We handle commercial builds mostly. Medical offices, municipal infrastructure, the occasional school addition. The job is logistics and people management in equal measure. Schedules, subcontractors, inspection timelines. I've been doing it long enough that I run the day on instinct more than effort, which my ex-wife once told me was either a skill or a warning sign, depending on how you looked at it. Carla and I separated 3 years before that night. No kids. The marriage lasted 6 years and ended the way a lot of them do, not in a fire but in a long, slow cooling. 2 people becoming polite strangers who still shared a mortgage. She was the one who finally named it out loud. She said I was good at managing everything except the distance between us. She wasn't wrong. I didn't argue. We sold the house in Stony Creek, split the proceeds cleanly, and I moved into a 2-bedroom unit in a low-rise building near the waterfront in Hamilton. My colleague and friend Trent moved in shortly after. He covered half the rent and kept the fridge stocked with things I'd never buy myself. Kombucha, 3 kinds of mustard, a block of aged cheddar he treated like a houseplant. Trent worked in the same industry, different company. We'd known each other since a site job in Brantford years ago. The kind of friendship built out of shared frustration with permit delays and bad weather and coffee that never stayed hot long enough. He was easy to live with, played hockey twice a week, kept his dishes done, was gone most weekends visiting his parents in Sudbury. The apartment got quiet when he left. I didn't mind quiet. My routine was uncomplicated by design. Up early, run along the waterfront trail before the lake fog burned off. Cook most evenings because restaurants felt like effort after a full day of managing other people. Weekends spent doing small repairs around the building, something the superintendent appreciated and I found genuinely calming. I replaced a door hinge in the laundry room one Saturday, rebuilt a cabinet frame in the mailroom the next. There was something satisfying about fixing things with your hands that had nothing to do with spreadsheets or contracts. I wasn't looking for anything. I want to be clear about that. I wasn't lonely in the way people mean when they say lonely. I had a life. It was just a quiet one, and I had made my peace with that. Vera Bouchard was an interior designer who worked out of a studio in Dundas. She came on as a consultant for a mixed-use development our firm was managing in Waterdown, the kind of project where the developer wants the lobby to feel like a boutique hotel, even though the budget says otherwise. Vera was brought in to manage that particular contradiction. The first time she came to our site trailer, she knocked once, opened the door without waiting, and set a floor plan on my desk. She pointed to the reception area and said, "If you put that structural column where you're planning, I lose the sight line to the feature wall, and the whole entrance reads like a corridor. Can we move it?" I looked at the drawing. Most consultants who walk into a construction trailer start with pleasantries and work up to the actual question. Vera started with the actual question. I told her I'd run the numbers and get back to her by end of week. She nodded, picked up her plan, and left. I got back to her by end of day. After that, we ran into each other regularly. Site walkthroughs, design coordination meetings, the occasional project lunch, where 6 people talked over each other for an hour and accomplished what 3 emails could have done in 10 minutes. Vera always brought her own coffee in a wide-mouthed thermos, dark roast, no sugar. She drew in the margins of her meeting notes with a fine tip pen while other people were talking. Not doodles, actual sketches, details she was working out. I noticed that early. She had a way of listening that was different from most people. Full attention, no phone, eyes on whoever was speaking. It made people talk more than they planned to. I caught myself doing it once, in a coordination call about tile specifications, going on about the load implications of a particular stone slab, and I realized partway through that I was talking more than the situation required. Vera was just watching me with that focused, patient look of hers. I stopped and apologized for the tangent. She said, "No, keep going." I was following it. Trent noticed her. He dropped me off at the site one morning when my truck was in the shop and spotted Vera coming across the parking lot in her work boots and canvas jacket. On the drive back, he said, "Who's that?" I told him. He said, "She walks like someone who knows exactly where she's going." I told him she was a consultant on the project. He left it alone, but he had that look he gets when he's filed something away for later. There is one other detail worth mentioning before I get back to that Thursday night. My apartment has a small storage locker in the basement, and Trent kept a spare key to it on a hook by the front door in case either of us needed to grab something when the other wasn't home. It was a plain key, nothing special, worn down on the teeth from years of use. I barely thought about it, but that key shows up in this story more than once, and later I understood exactly why. So, Thursday evening 8:30, a casserole dish on my counter. Vera had pulled off the foil and was looking for oven mitts. I told her the drawer beside the stove. She found them, set the dish in the oven at 350, and turned to face me with her arms crossed and a completely untroubled expression. She said she'd made too much shepherd's pie, and the building had no recycling bin and her fridge was already full. It was a reasonable explanation. The project was going into its final inspection stretch and we'd both had a brutal week. Sharing a meal after a long Thursday made a kind of practical sense. But it was 8:30 on a Thursday, and she'd driven from Dundas to Hamilton with a casserole dish. And she knew Trent was out of town because she'd mentioned it in passing at the Wednesday coordination meeting, dropped it into the conversation so lightly that I hadn't registered it as intentional. I grabbed 2 plates and set the table. We ate at the kitchen table with the overhead light on and the balcony door open a crack because the building runs warm in October. The lake was out there somewhere in the dark. You could hear it if you listened. Vera told me about the project she was finishing in Burlington, a dental office where the client kept changing his mind about the accent wall color. She'd now painted the same wall 4 times. She said it without irritation, which I found more impressive than the patience itself. She said, "Some people need to see a thing wrong several times before they know what they actually want. It's not the worst process, just the most expensive one." I said I knew the feeling. She smiled at that quickly, like she'd caught something she wasn't going to point out. She asked about the project, the waterdown build, how the inspection timeline was holding. I told her we were 3 days ahead of schedule, which in this industry is the closest thing to a miracle. She laughed at that, a real one, and I realized it was the first time I had heard her laugh, not a polite chuckle in a meeting but an actual laugh, unguarded and unhurried. The dish ran out. We talked past the dishes being done and the leftovers wrapped, and the thermos emptied. She sat across from me with her hands around a glass of water and told me about growing up in Timmins. Her father worked the mine. Her mother ran a daycare out of their house for 20 years. She said she got into design because in Timmins, when you're a kid staring down 8 months of winter, you learn that the inside of a space is everything. You learn that a room can feel like a shelter or like a trap depending on how someone thought about it before you got there. She said, "I wanted to spend my life making spaces feel like shelter." I listened to all of it. I'm not a man who talks easily about himself, but I have always known how to listen without filling the silence. That night I found myself wanting to hear more than I was given, which was a new feeling, and one I didn't examine too closely in the moment. Here is what I didn't know then, but what I suspect you've already worked out. Vera had planned the evening, not in a calculated way, but in the careful way of someone who is brave enough to create an opening and honest enough to need a reason to walk through it. Trent being away was not a coincidence. The shepherd's pie was not an accident of excess. She had made a decision somewhere between the Wednesday meeting and Thursday morning, and she'd followed through on it. The only variable was how I'd receive it, and she had no way of knowing that I was very possibly the slowest man in the province when it came to reading anything that wasn't a construction drawing. I want to go back now and fill in some of the moments I didn't read clearly while they were happening. There was an afternoon on the Waterdown site, early March, the ground still half frozen. I was walking the building envelope with the exterior cladding rep, checking the sill details at the second-floor windows, when Vera appeared on the scaffold behind us. She'd come to look at the stone coursing on the feature wall and she'd brought her field notebook, already open to a page of sketches. The cladding rep asked her something about the reveal dimensions, and she answered him without looking up from the notebook, gave him a number, then looked over at me and said, "That window spec is going to read smaller than the drawing suggests. The frame profile eats more of the sightline than you'd think." I looked. She was right. I'd looked at that drawing 30 times. She was right on the first pass. On the drive back to the trailer, I thought about how few people can walk onto an active construction site and see it the way she did. Not the process, but the finished thing, the thing it would eventually be. I thought about it for longer than the observation required. There was the morning I came back from a brutal 2-hour inspection meeting with the building department, the kind of meeting where nothing gets resolved, and everyone leaves with more paperwork than they arrived with. When I got to my desk, there was a coffee cup sitting on the corner, a paper cup from the cafe on King Street, 2 blocks from the office, no note. My name written on the side in the way they do, but someone had crossed out the printed sleeve design and drawn a small window with a tiny view of mountains, because Vera knew from a conversation we'd had that I'd spent 2 weeks hiking in Jasper the summer before, and it was the trip I talked about most. I sat down and looked at it for a full minute before I drank any of it. There was a moment in a progress meeting, mid-April, the kind of meeting that runs long because the schedule is slipping and no one wants to be the one to say it. I was presenting the revised critical path to the project team. 6 people at the table, the developer on the phone, a consultant joining by video from Vancouver. Partway through, I looked up from the schedule on my screen to make a point about the mechanical rough-in sequence. Vera was at the end of the table. She was looking at me with a steadiness that wasn't quite like the way she looked at other people in the meeting. When I finished the point, she gave one small nod, minimal, not for the room. I noticed it. I told myself it didn't mean anything particular, but I remembered it exactly, the angle of it, the timing. Back to Thursday. We moved from the table to the couch because the chairs are not comfortable for long conversations. The balcony door was still open, and the lake sounds had changed, the water more restless. The building was quiet around us. Vera tucked her feet up beside her and turned toward me, and the lamp behind her cast the room in that specific warm light that October evenings have when the windows are dark. She said, "Can I ask you something?" I said yes. She said, "Do you think some people take longer to trust something good than they do to get over something bad?" I thought about it. I said, "I think some people confuse caution with wisdom." She looked at me for a moment. "Are you one of them?" I didn't answer, not because I didn't know, because I knew exactly, and the answer was yes, and I wasn't ready to say it out loud to someone who was watching me the way she was watching me right then. She didn't push. She held the question in the air between us and let it stay there. She had a patience about her that I couldn't fully account for, like she had already run the odds on this particular evening and was content with however it resolved. Before she left, she stopped at the hook near the front door where Trent's spare key hung. She looked at it the way she looked at design details on a job site, with focused attention. She said, "Is that a spare?" I said yes. She said, "You should keep that somewhere, you won't lose it." She smiled, just a small one, and went out. I stood there after the door closed, and I could smell coffee and something herbal from wherever she'd been sitting, and the apartment felt the way a room feels when the right person has just left, and the air hasn't settled yet. 3 weeks after that Thursday, we started seeing each other outside the project. It happened without a conversation about what it was. She texted me on a Saturday morning, said she was driving out to Dundas Peak if I wanted to come. I did. We walked the trail above the Dundas Valley with the valley laid out below us in early November light, the maples already stripped to their outlines, the sky that particular flat gray that means the cold is coming for real. We talked for 4 hours without noticing the time. Her theory of why brutalist buildings are misunderstood. My argument that the best renovation you can make to a house is a functioning mudroom. The specific pleasure of a properly calibrated table saw. The way Timmins in January teaches you either resignation or creativity, and she had chosen creativity. I invited her to the workshop in my building's basement garage one Sunday afternoon, where I was refinishing an oak rocking chair I'd found on the curb in Westdale. She sat on an upturned plastic crate with her thermos and asked questions about the wood grain while I worked through the grits. She knew what she was looking at. She asked about the original finish, whether I could tell what decade it was from. I showed her where to look. She leaned in close to the chair arm and examined it the way she examined every detail she cared about, with full attention and no rush. We didn't name what was happening. We hadn't held hands. We hadn't said anything about what any of this meant. But Trent, every time he came home from Sudbury and found a second coffee cup in the dish rack, or her jacket on the hook by the door, would raise his eyebrows at me in slow motion and then go to the fridge for a beer without saying a word. He was the right kind of friend. He knew when to be quiet. Then Carla showed up. I need to say something about Carla before I say what happened. Carla is not a villain. She is a person who makes decisions based on what she wants, and then believes those decisions are logical. The distinction matters. She walked into my office on a Tuesday morning, with her dark coat on, and her hair down, and the expression she always wore when she'd already rehearsed the conversation. She said she'd been thinking. She said the last 3 years had given her perspective. She said she believed we'd both walked away from something real without trying hard enough. She used the word foundation. She said our relationship had good bones and we'd let it fall into disrepair. I noticed she used construction metaphors when talking to me. I had always been a more attentive audience for the right vocabulary. I told her I didn't think we'd left anything unfinished. I told her the separation had been mutual and considered, and I didn't feel it had been a mistake. I said it without cruelty. I meant it. And then I made the error of thinking the conversation was concluded. Carla saw Vera. Or rather, she saw a text from Vera arrive on my phone screen, face up on my desk, while we were talking. She couldn't read it, but she saw the name. And Carla had known me for 9 years total, which is long enough to know things about a person that they don't announce. What she did next was careful. She found out through a mutual contact in the industry who Vera was. Then she contacted Vera directly, reached her by email, said she was an associate of mine dealing with a contract matter on my behalf. Got on a call with her. Did not lie about who she was once directly asked, but created, in the space of a 15-minute conversation, the distinct and false impression that she and I were in regular contact, that we had been working through some unresolved things, that I was someone who kept old doors open while appearing to have closed them. And she mentioned carefully that I had told her I wasn't really seeing anyone seriously right now. That was a lie. I had said no such thing to Carla. I hadn't spoken to Carla in 9 months before she walked into my office, but Vera had no way to know that, and Carla was betting on the gap. Vera pulled back, not dramatically. There was no confrontation, no call, no text. She simply became professional. Response times lengthened. The Saturday morning trail stopped. The texts in the evenings that had nothing to do with the project, the coffee cups. All of it went quiet at once, like a frequency that had been playing beneath everything and had simply stopped. I noticed the absence, the way you notice a sound you didn't know you were using to orient yourself. The project texts were still there, the site coordination, but the other thing was gone, and the space it left felt larger than I could have predicted. Trent figured it out before I did. He works in an industry where reading people and situations quickly is a professional requirement, and he applies it with equal efficiency to his personal life. He came home one Wednesday evening, dropped his bag, got a beer, and sat across from me at the counter. He said, "Something happened with Vera." It wasn't a question. I told him I didn't know what. He said he'd seen her in the parking garage of the Waterdown site the previous day. He said she hadn't seemed upset, but she'd seemed decided. He said she told me she doesn't get involved with complicated situations, that it wasn't who she was. I asked him what she meant by complicated. He put the beer down. He said, "Carla called her Fletcher." And then he told me what he knew, because Trent knows things. He talks to people in the industry the way other people check the weather, constantly and without thinking about it. He told me about the call. He told me what Carla had implied. He told me the part that wasn't true. I sat at that counter, and I felt the structure of the last several months realign itself the way a building settles when the load shifts. Everything clicking into a new configuration that made sudden and complete sense. The coffee on the bad Tuesday. The nod in the meeting, the shepherd's pie driven across the valley on a cold Thursday night, the question about trusting something good. Every moment I had received and not quite known what to do with, arranged now into something I understood. I had been the last to know. Again, I stood up and took the spare key off the hook by the door. I didn't know why. I turned it in my hand for a moment, the worn teeth, the slight heft of it. I put it in my jacket pocket. I drove to Vera's studio in Dundas on a Friday evening. It was a ground-floor space in a converted building on King Street West, large windows, a work table visible from the street with samples arranged on it, in some order that made sense to her. The light inside was still on when I pulled up, which told me she was finishing something. I knocked. She came to the door in her canvas jacket, still wearing her reading glasses, a pen behind her ear. She looked at me without surprise, not warmly, not coldly. She looked at me the way she had looked at the shepherd's pie situation, which is to say with full attention and no performance of an emotion she wasn't certain she felt. I didn't open with pleasantries. I had spent an hour on the drive figuring out what I wanted to say, and I had decided on honesty arranged plainly, which is the only approach I've ever been able to sustain. I said, "Carla came to my office 12 days ago. I told her the same thing I told her 3 years ago, which is that we are finished and I have no interest in revisiting it." I did not tell her I wasn't seeing anyone seriously. I haven't spoken to her in 9 months before that visit, and whatever she said to you on that call was designed to give you a false picture of what was actually happening, because that is how Carla responds when she believes something is no longer available to her. Vera took her glasses off. She held them in her hand. I said, "I should have told you earlier that she'd come to see me. I didn't because it felt like old noise that didn't belong in something new. That was the wrong call." Vera leaned against the doorframe. Behind her the studio was warm and bright, samples and sketches covering the work table, a mug steaming on the corner near the window. She looked at me for a long moment with the specific patience she had that I had never quite been able to account for. She said, "Why didn't you say something sooner? About any of it?" I said, "Because I'm better at reading drawings than situations. I can look at a structural plan and tell you exactly where the load is going and where the risk is. With people I'm slower. I've been wrong before about what something meant, and I didn't want to be wrong about this. But here's what I do know. Since you stopped texting me things that had nothing to do with the project, I have had no idea what to do with my evenings. I tried to replace the coffee cup on my desk with my own coffee and it was not the same. It was actively worse." She looked at me for another moment, then she laughed. It started small and got real, and she shook her head slowly. "Fletcher," she said, "I drove to Hamilton with a hot casserole dish on a Thursday night. I knew your roommate was in Sudbury. I had checked the site schedule to confirm you weren't working late. Did you seriously think I came for the shepherd's pie?" I said. "The shepherd's pie was very good," she said. "It's a Timmins recipe, my mother's. I don't make it for just anyone." She stepped back from the door, not all the way, just enough. I stepped inside. I told her everything in the order it had happened. Carla coming to the office, what she'd said. The part I knew was false and how I knew it. I told her that the morning after Carla left, I had gone to my desk and sat down, and the first thing I noticed was that the corner of my desk was empty, and the second thing I noticed was that I was angrier about that than anything Carla had said to me. Vera listened the way she always listened. Full attention, no phone, eyes on me. When I finished, she said, "Okay, just that." Then she said, "Thank you for coming." I reached into my jacket pocket and I set the spare key on her work table, beside the mug. She looked at it. She looked at me. I said, "I know it's a construction site key and it doesn't open anything at my apartment. But I've been carrying it since Wednesday and I couldn't figure out why until just now. I think it's because you said I should keep it somewhere. I wouldn't lose it. I didn't want to lose it." She was quiet for a long time. Then she picked it up and held it in her palm, the way I had held it standing at my front door. She set it back down carefully, like something that mattered, and looked at the table. "Okay," she said again, and this time it meant something different. "I met Carla one last time, the following Monday. I chose the Limmeridge Mall food court because I needed a place where nothing could become a scene. She was there when I arrived with her coat over her chair and a coffee going cold beside her. She started before I sat down. I let her say one sentence and then I stopped her. I kept it short. I said, "You called Vera. I know what you told her. I want to be direct with you because I think you deserve directness. We are done. We were done 3 years ago and nothing has changed about that. Please don't contact anyone in my life again," she cried. "I have learned to tell the difference between tears that come from actual loss and tears that come from losing a thing you decided you should still have. These were the second kind. I'm not saying that coldly. I'm saying it accurately. I put enough cash on the table for both coffees and left. That evening I drove home, took my jacket off, and looked at the spare key hook by the front door. It was empty now. The key was in Dundas on a work table in a lit studio, and I found I didn't mind that at all. What happened after that happened the way things do when they're actually right. Quietly, without ceremony, at a pace that made sense. Vera started coming to Hamilton on Friday evenings, not with an excuse, with groceries. She had a system, efficient and unsentimental, the way she had a system for everything. She would text me from the car with the category, Italian or Asian, or she'd say Timmins, which meant the shepherd's pie again, which I was never going to argue with. Trent came home one Friday to find the two of us cooking, and a jazz station on the kitchen speaker, and his aged cheddar being used without permission. He stood in the doorway for 3 full seconds, looked at me over Vera's head, put his hand over his heart in mock anguish about the cheese, and went to the fridge for a beer. We didn't announce anything, we didn't post anything, or send a group text, or have a conversation about what this was. We just showed up for each other steadily, and after a while the steadiness became the fact. 4 months in, Vera was doing a project consultation in Timmins, and I drove up with her for the weekend. Her mother lived in the same house where Vera grew up, a solid 70s bungalow on a street that still had its original spruce trees. Her mother met us at the door and looked at me the way mothers look at the people their children bring home, which is to say thoroughly and without apology. She said, "Vera tells me you're in construction." I said I was. She said, "Good, there's a door frame in the basement that's been soft for 2 years. Her father would have had it done in a weekend." She smiled when she said it. Vera put her face in her hands. I fixed the door frame on Saturday morning. Her mother made pancakes. 6 months after the Thursday with the casserole dish, Trent bought a condo in Westdale. He'd been talking about it for years, and he finally stopped talking and did it. The night before he moved out, we sat on the balcony in the cold with cans of Molson and said nothing important for a long time, which is what you do when you've been friends long enough that you don't need the conversation to feel like an occasion. Before he left the next morning, he took the spare key off the hook by the door. He set it on the counter. He said, "You know what to do with that." I looked at the key lying there in the morning light. He pulled me into a hug, the real kind, and then he carried his box to the elevator. 9 months after that first Thursday, Vera moved her things in over a long weekend in August. There was no specific moment of decision. Her toothbrush had been in my bathroom for months. Her thermos was on the counter. She had 3 sample binders on the shelf beside my construction manuals, and they looked correct there, like they'd always been. She brought 1 plant from her studio, a trailing pothos that had lived in her south-facing window for years. She put it on the kitchen windowsill where the morning light would find it first. She had the watered-down project site plan, the coordination drawing from our very first walkthrough together, the one where she'd marked the sightline issue with the column in her own handwriting, framed and hung it in the hallway near the door. I looked at it for a long time one morning, the small window opening in the lobby, the note in the margin in her handwriting that said column issue here, C. Fletcher. I thought about that. The first drawing she'd ever shown me. The first question she'd ever asked me, direct and practical and already knowing what she needed. She'd been paying attention from the beginning. I was the one who had taken the long route. 1 year after that first Thursday, we drove up to Dundas Peak again. The same trail, the same valley below, the November light doing what November light does over the escarpment, flattening everything to gray and gold. We walked without hurrying. A couple with a dog passed us, a woman running. The valley was quiet the way it is when the season is changing. Near the lookout there is a bench made of timber and stone that sits at the edge of the view. Vera had mentioned it once, told me that one of her design professors had used it as an example in a class about proportion and material fit. She had a specific affection for it. I stopped at the bench. I took out a small box. Inside, on a thin silver chain, was the spare key. I had taken it from her work table one afternoon when she wasn't looking, brought it to a jeweler, had it cleaned and polished and hung on the chain properly, and put it back before she returned from her meeting. She had noticed and said nothing. I had known she noticed. I held it out to her. I said, "This is a key from a storage locker in a building we no longer share. But you kept it on your workbench and I kept my eye on it, and it seems more right on that chain around your neck than anywhere else I can think of. Not because it opens anything, but because the first thing you ever said to me was a question you already knew the answer to, and you waited a very long time for me to catch up. This is me catching up." Vera took the chain. She held it in her palm and looked at it for a long moment, the way she looks at details she is deciding to trust. The valley was spread out below us, leafless and wide and gray gold in the early cold. She said, "You know, when I drove to your apartment with that shepherd's pie, I had an alternative reason prepared in case it didn't go well. Too much food, no room in the fridge, building had no bin. I had it ready. But you let me in and you set the table and you listened for 3 hours and you never once made me feel like I needed the excuse." She closed her fingers around the key. She said, "Nobody does that. You did that." I said, "You made shepherd's pie, from scratch, in November." She laughed and the sound went out over the valley and into the gray November air, and I felt something settle in me that had been unsettled for for longer than I'd realized, the way a building finally finds its grade after the ground has had time to compact and settle properly beneath it. She put the chain over her neck and tucked the key beneath her jacket, against her chest. I used to think that being careful with your trust was the same as being wise about it. I know now that it isn't. Careful can become a habit, and habits are not the same as choices. Vera didn't come to my door to change me or fix me or tell me what was missing. She came because she had looked at who I actually was, and decided it was worth a casserole dish and a 45-minute drive on a November Thursday. She still wears the key, every day. Sometimes when she's reading on the couch, she reaches up and touches it with her fingertips, lightly, the way you touch something you are glad you kept. I notice every time. If someone shows up at your door with a practical explanation and a look in their eye that tells you the explanation isn't the point, let them in. Set the table. Listen, is there someone who has been paying attention to you in the quiet way, the way that doesn't announce itself? Is there a door you've been standing behind that you could open if you let yourself? Leave a comment. I read everyone. And if this story reached you somewhere real, share it with someone who's been waiting for permission to knock.